Thank you for joining us and welcome to today's research webinar, Using Cycling Impedance to Assess the Potential Benefits of New Cycling Infrastructure. I'm Sarah Schramer. I'm the Policy Director with the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, or NCST. Housed at the Institute of Transportation Studies at UC Davis, the NCST is part of the University Transportation Center's program, administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation. The NCST provides national leadership in advancing environmentally sustainable transportation through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of our future leaders. UC Davis leads the NCST consortium with partner centers at CSU Long Beach, Georgia Tech, Texas Southern, UC Riverside, the University of Southern California, and the University of Vermont. We'll be recording this webinar today, and the recording will be available on our website, along with the presentation slides in the coming days. During the presentation, please use the Q&A feature that's available at the bottom of your Zoom window to type in your questions. We'll reserve time after the presentation, roughly 15-20 minutes, to get through as many of those questions as possible. And lastly, you're going to see a quick survey at the end of the webinar for you to share your thoughts with us on today's presentation and thoughts for future presentations that you might want to hear about. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Reid Passmore is a Ph.D. candidate at Georgia Tech in civil engineering, focused on supporting cycling for transportation across the U.S. His current work includes capturing how cyclists navigate street networks and terrain using machine learning models. Reid has been honored with the Dwight David Eisenhower Fellowship, the Georgia Tech President's Fellowship, and the Center for Transportation Equity Decisions and Dollars Student Dissertation Scholarship. He's currently a visiting scholar here at ITS Davis. So with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and I will pass it over to Reid. Just a moment. Okay.
Thank you. Share my screen. And just to confirm, we're seeing the presentation.
Yes. Yes, looks
awesome.
good.
Okay. Awesome. All right, I'll give it a start. So, my name, Reid Passmore, and today I'm going to be presenting some of my work on my dissertation using changes in revealed impedance to assess the potential of new cycling infrastructure using bikeway sim. Starting with the introduction. So the real and perceived danger that is faced by cyclists when sharing the same space as motor vehicles is a major deterrent to the widespread adoption of cycling. And people, regardless of cycling frequency or ability, state that they would be more willing to try cycling on road with bicycle facilities that provide a buffer or separation from car traffic. But these facilities, the question is, where do we put them and what types specifically do we build? They require political and public buy-in when there's often limited existing funding sources for them. There's also a risk of misplacing or under-designing bicycle facilities to the point that no one ends up using them. So ultimately, we want to build these facilities in places that pose the greatest chance for seeing or building towards future increases in cycling. So to accomplish that, my dissertation was largely aligned with creating this tool called Bikeway Sim. And so it's an open source repository for building an all viable paths network for cycling, calibrating cycling impedance factors from cycling GPS traces, finding the minimum cycling impedance route between any 2 points, and assessing proposed cycling facilities through 5 different metrics. So Bikeway Sim primarily relies on impedance. And impedance represents the relative cost or difficulty of travel. So impedance can be in time units, dollars, or it can also be unitless. And it's relative, meaning that the difference between alternatives is what matters most. So for motor vehicles, impedance factors, which represent the different aspects of impedance, include travel time, parking, and tolls. But for cyclists, on the other hand, I had to consult the cycling route choice literature. So cycling route choice develops behavioral inferences for how cyclists choose routes based on route attributes. So I looked at 19 different studies which showed that cyclist route decisions are impacted by road attributes, such as the number of lanes, the speed limit on a road, the elevation change along a route, the presence of bicycle facilities, and the frequency of turns in traffic signals. So ultimately, cycling impedance has to consider these attributes in addition to travel time. When I was examining the cycling route choice literature, one gap that stood out to me is that while there was plenty of literature on estimating cycling route choice models, there was limited literature on actually applying these route choice models for estimating cycling impedance factors, which I'll get to in a future slide, and planning bicycle facilities. So this research addresses this gap by creating a method for estimating cycling impedance factors and then actually applying these impedance factors in a framework that can be used to plan new cycling facilities. So before going much further, I'm going to introduce some network terminology. So starting with this figure on the left, you're looking at a graph representation of a street network. So the streets are represented by these white lines that are called links. And the links have the intersection of the streets or the links, and the dead ends of streets or links are called nodes. Those are the circles. And then this figure on the right shows you how turns are represented. So a turn is represented as a link-to-link transition. So as you go from link to link, it measures the distance change or the angle change between your heading on each link to figure out if it was a left turn, a right turn, or a straight movement. All right, so modeling routes with impedance factors. So impedance functions are what actually apply the impedance factors to the network links and turns. And then Dijkstra's algorithm can then be used to find the least impedance route between any 2 points. So if travel time is the only impedance factor being used, the resulting route is the least travel time route. And if you're using cycling and travel time impedance factors, then you're getting the lowest impedance route or also the user preferred route. So as a demonstration on this figure on the right, you're looking at 2 routes between 2 points. The green dot is the starting point, the origin, and then the red dot is the destination. The black route on the left represents the least travel time route. It's more direct, and it takes this picture that's bordered in black on the left, which is a 4-lane arterial. It's not a very pleasant place to bike. And then the route on the right in purple, which takes the figure that's bordered in purple, the Atlanta Beltline multi-use trail. This is a lot more pleasant to bike on because you're separated from motor vehicles. But as we can see in the graphic, the purple route is more indirect. So the impedance directs it off of the high-stress facilities, such as that 4-lane arterial, and onto the multi-use path. But the next question is, how do we actually get these impedance factors to do this kind of work? So in this work, we directly estimate them from cycling GPS traces, which I'll describe in the next slide. But we're utilizing a method or building on top of a method started by Schweizer et al. 2020, using stochastic optimization to estimate these impedance factors. So some limitations of this approach that we addressed in this work are that they didn't consider very many impedance factors, and there was no consideration for turn impedance factors. And then lastly, maybe most importantly, there weren't estimated parameters to describe the impedance factors, which I'll get to in a future slide. So a cycling GPS trace shows the second-by-second trajectory data of a cyclist, which shows how they navigated through a network. These traces have to be map-matched to the network. And what I mean by this is, look at the figure on the right. The black dots represent the GPS trace, so that's the second-by-second trajectory data. This data alone does not tell you which sequence of links that were taken. That's what the map matching process does, and the red represents the map matching process. So those are cycling GPS traces, and now that we have our direct estimation method, I'm going to describe the BikeWaySim impedance factor calibration methodology. So the optimization algorithm that we used was called particle swarm optimization. There are 2 main things that I want to convey with this type of algorithm, is that it's one, population based, So we're testing multiple sets of candidate impedance factors or cycling impedance factors simultaneously. And then it also incorporates randomness, meaning that the initial selection of those candidate impedance factors and the subsequent updates as the algorithm proceeds incorporates randomness in how it updates. So a simple visualization of this process is shown on the right. So we have these x's that start distributed throughout the graph, and they converge on what is the global minimum for this example function. And we can see as the number of iterations proceeds, it starts to hone in. So that is a little bit about how that works. Now I want to describe how what the objective of this optimization process is for impedance calibration. So using link and turn impedance factors, which I'm going to represent with betas, we want to maximize the average similarity between the chosen and the modeled routes. So this figure on the right shows the chosen route in orange, and then the modeled route that's modeled with our impedance factors in a blue dashed line. And it goes between point A and point B. So we want to maximize the similarity between these two lines, and the way we do that is through the Jacquard index. So Jacquard index measures the intersection of two objects over their union. This value is always between 0 and 1, 0 being no similarity whatsoever, and 1 being complete similarity. So the area of the roots, or the buffered area of the roots, they're both buffered by 100 feet. And then this area is used as the basis for calculating intersection and union. So essentially, we find the intersecting area, and then we divide it by the net area or the union of the area. And that gives us the Jacquard index for that trip. And then we average that across all the trips to get an average similarity metric. All right, so a visualization of what this process actually looks like. Here we have two dots. The green dot is the start point, and then the red dot at the south part of the map is the end point. And the chosen route is shown in red, and then the dark black routes are the various modeled routes that we're getting with our impedance factors. So again, the optimization method that we're using is population-based. So there's going to be multiple routes that are being tested at once. And we can see that it's searching throughout this street network, and it's covering quite a wide variety of different routes. And some of these are closer to the chosen route than others. So that is generally how that process proceeds. And it's important to remember that this is occurring across many trips at once. So whatever trip or whatever the final modeled route that is the resulting route that is the optimum won't necessarily be the optimum for that one trip. All right, so that's the optimization process. And then there's one additional step that we add on this, the bootstrap method. So this was developed by Evfron and Tibshirani, and it allows us to estimate parameters for those impedance factors, that being the mean, the standard error, and the confidence interval that would normally be infeasible to estimate by analytical means. So essentially, we rerun the calibration process 1,000 times with 1,000 bootstrap samples, where the bootstrap samples are created by drawing with replacement from our sample of chosen routes. All right, so those two components, the optimization and the bootstrap method, that is the calibration methodology. And now I'm going to go over what it looks like once we actually use real data. So the GPS traces that we're using come from an app called Cycle Atlanta that collected crowdsourced cycling GPS traces between 2012 and 2016. After processing and map matching this data, we had around 2,500 unique trips across 650 users. We split this data into a training and a testing set. So in the training set, this just incorporated one trip from each user selected at random. And then the training set was the remaining trips that were left over. next I'm going to go over the impedance factor coefficients, or the network variables that we used. So I first want to direct your attention to the table. So starting with the first column, this indicates if the impedance factor was a link or a turn impedance factor. And then moving on to the second column, this indicates the general category. So we had categories for the number of lanes, speed, the grade of the road, the presence of cycling facilities, a one turn characteristic variable, and then the type of turn movement. And so the third column, the last column, represents the actual specific variable name. Most of these might be self-explanatory, but I need to explain the unsignalized crossing variable. So in this case, what that variable indicates is that someone is taking a straight or left turn movement across a busy road. And a busy road in this case is a road that has a high speed limit, or a large number of lanes, or heavy traffic volume. And it does not have a traffic signal. So that's what that unsignalized crossing variable means. All right, in addition to that, we need to establish a base case because impedance is relative. So for links, the base impedance was the travel time of the link. And then we set two different types of links to only have the base impedance applied to them. And those two types were flat pedestrian paths, and then also flat roads with a speed limit of 30 miles per hour or below, and 1 lane per direction. So these were essentially residential streets. For the turn impedance, that was set to 0, and anything that was, so that means that if there were no turn impedance is implied, then the turn impedance was 0. And straight movements that were not part of an unsignalized crossing were the base turn link type. Okay, moving on to the bootstrap model results. So this is the large table that I want to walk through. The first column represents whether or not it was a turn or a link impedance. And then the next column describes the units. So one thing I didn't describe in the previous slide was that link impedance is in proportional time units. So whenever we look at the beta values, which are where the mean column is, it's going to represent a proportional increase in travel time. And then if it's a turn impedance, it's going to add just travel time, so it'll just be in minutes. So whenever we go over to the beta values, and we can do that now. So starting at the first row and then going to the column that says mean, it's 0.17. So that indicates that relative to the travel time, or the impedance relative to the base impedance, which is link travel time, is increased by 0.17 proportionally. And then if we go down to the turn column and we see 1.22 for that unsignalized crossing variable, that's going to indicate that 1.22 minutes were added as a result of that impedance. Okay, and then proceeding, we have our variables, and this is in the same order as the previous slide. Then we have our search bounds. One thing to mention is that particle swarm optimization is bounded. So you have to select some initial search bounds to start the process of searching for the optimum set of impedance factors. And this, you can go outside the search bound in this process, but whenever you select your initial value, it starts in this area. Next, we have the mean, which is the beta value, and is the mean of the bootstrap results. Then we have the standard error, the median, and then the 95% confidence interval. So some takeaways from this are that 1, the magnitudes and signs generally match expectation. So honing in on this lanes variable. As we increase the number of lanes, the impedance applied, it also increases. And the sign is positive, meaning that it adds impedance. So that makes sense. And then we also see that for bicycle facilities, these values are all negative. which means that they reduce impedance, which is good. One last thing I want to highlight is how to interpret these confidence intervals. For many of the variables, they are quite large, and this indicates a couple of different things. One, that amongst our cyclists that were in our cycling GPS traces, they had very varied preferences, and they also likely had different opportunities to actually use links that had these attributes. So for interpreting this, if it contained 0, the confidence interval contained 0, it was deemed insignificant. So this only happened for 2 different variables. And essentially, because it's a 95% confidence interval, our mean value is equally likely within those bounds. So that just shows you that there's a huge range of preferences amongst cyclists. And the variables that did show up as insignificant still are meaningful. So one thing I want to hone down is the cycle track variable. So this confidence interval ended up containing 0, so it was insignificant. But in terms of the actual confidence interval, it went from negative 0.93 to 0. And so some users did actually assign a very high impedance reduction to the cycle track variable. And one reason that this variable likely wasn't significant was that there were a few cycle tracks in Atlanta at the time that the data was collected. And so having each user actually display a preference for cycle tracks is difficult when that's the case. All right, this next slide is going to show you how the different impedance factors combine. So the first column is for the speed limit. The next column is for the lanes per direction. And then the preceding 4 columns are different link types. So the first is a pedestrian path. The second is a multi-use path, and then a road with a bike lane. So the main things I want to get from this are first the link base impedance. So we set these to be pedestrian paths and then roads with a speed limit less than 30 miles per hour, and then 1 lane per direction. So that shows up as 0 as we set it to be. And then the other thing that you may have noticed from the previous slide is that the road with bike lane impedance factor is actually more negative, meaning that it has a greater impedance reduction effect than the multi-use path variable. And so this may seem counterintuitive initially because multi-use paths provide complete separation from motor vehicles. But once you consider the fact that bike lanes can interact with the other impedance factors that roads have, such as the speed limit and the lanes per direction, it starts to make more sense. So as you increase the speed or the lanes per direction, then that impedance reduction effect from bike lanes starts to dwindle. All right, and then next I'm going to go over the objective function value. So again, the objective function was this Jacquard index that ranged from 0 to 1, and we recalculated the Jacquard index for each trip using the median impedance factors from that bootstrap model table a while ago. And then when we calculated the average for the training set, the calibrated impedance factors value was 0.47. And then using just the travel time impedance, it was 0.36. So there was a 30% increase from one to the other. And then for testing, the testing set, that value was 0.43 and 0.37. So that was a slightly less increase in Jacquard index, so 16%. So this indicates that there's still room for improvement. And to further illustrate how exactly where exactly these improvements were made in explaining the chosen path, I want to direct your attention to the figure on the right. So this is a histogram of the Jacquard index values for each trip using both the shortest impedance factor and then the calibrated impedance factor. And those are shown in gray and then blue respectively. So anything on the x-axis, again, ranges from 0 to 1, because that's the Jacquard index, so it can only be between 0 and 1. And when we're going from the shortest to the calibrated in this 0 to around 0.25 range, we see a reduction in that the trips that are being explained, or more trips are being explained using the calibrated impedance factors. So the blue distribution is shifting to the right relative to the gray distribution. So that shows where exactly we're making improvements in explaining those trips. All right, so some limitations of this approach are that trips have to be destination oriented, meaning that travel time must be an impedance. So exercise trips, recreational rides, and group rides cannot be used for this. And then also loop trips, where the origin and the destination are one and the same, do also not work. There are issues with the Cycle Atlanta data. They tended to be overrepresented by white college-educated men. And this was exacerbated by this being the early smartphone days when this data was collected. And the sampling method wasn't the most rigorous used. So, and then the last thing associated with this is that whenever we're calibrating the impedance factors, it is very difficult to account for all the intercorrelation that goes on between the different road attributes. All right, so some future work suggestions associated with this are collecting GPS trace data through travel diaries that are gathered through more rigorous sampling methods that would hopefully allow us to estimate more generalizable impedance factors. If this is infeasible, one potential idea that I had was using suggested routes from local cyclists or advocacy organizations to develop a priori impedance factors that can later be readjusted once actual data is collected. Additionally, collect detailed network data, and then these two data collection suggestions in combination will allow us to calibrate more impedance factors as that data become available. All right. So moving on, we have our calibrated impedance factors, and the next step is to actually use them in showing the impacts of new bicycle facilities. So first I want to introduce the study area. It's 250 square miles, and it's within the Atlanta metro area. So this figure on the right shows the study area as the crosshatched portion that's bounded with this red outline that represents Interstate 285. And then the other interstates are shown in black and are shown for reference. So this study area included most of or all of Atlanta, Decatur, and several other cities. So next I'm going to introduce the assessment framework. So that would be this figure on the right, and we're going to walk through this one step at a time. But first, I want to tell a little bit more about what we're doing. So we're going to assess the impacts of 117 planned bicycle facilities in the city of Atlanta. And this will include bicycle lanes and cycle tracks. And we're using origin destination data from the Atlanta Regional Commission's TIP Amendment 6 activity-based model run for the year 2030. So the first part of this process we're going to start with are the OD pairs. So the OD pairs that we're using correspond to traffic analysis zones. We pre-process the data to remove any trips that were above 3 miles and to also remove intrazonal trips. We matched each TAZ centroid to the nearest network node by Euclidean distance so that we could do shortest path routing. This led to a final OD count of 1,100 TAZs, which constituted 130,000 unique OD pairs, representing 3.5 million trips, which had 650,000 people across 480,000 households. So I want to direct your attention to the figure on the right. What you're looking at are the TAZs with various points of interest pointed out. So each TAZ is color-coded according to the number of trip origins from it. And the green represents the existing bicycle facilities that are shown for reference. So the darkest blue areas were concentrated in the Midtown area and downtown Atlanta area. And there was also a concentration in Buckhead towards the north of the study area. So these areas are going to come back up in the future slides, so just keep an eye out for that. All right, next I'm going to move on to the next step of the process. So we're going to establish the current network. So that is the street network as it is today. So no improvements, just as it is. And then the future network is the network that's going to contain the 117 improvements that we're going to evaluate. And once we have those two networks, we can use Dijkstra's algorithm to find the lowest cost route between any 2 points. So this is run twice for the current network. The first time is using travel time as the impedance factor, and then the second time is using the calibrated impedance factors. And then it's run once for the future network using just the calibrated impedance factors. So these routes are then stored to generate 5 different approaches that show the impacts of the proposed bicycle facilities. Due to time constraints, I'm going to only go over 3 of these, which are trip impedance reduction, improvement impedance reduction, and bike sheds. All right, for trip impedance reduction. So this represents the average or the weighted average impedance reduction for a TAZ that is caused by the added bicycle facilities. So starting with the figure on the right, you're looking at a zoomed in map of the TAZs, and this time they're color coded according to the weighted average impedance reduction. So this ranges from 0 to 2.7 minutes. The added bicycle facilities are shown in orange and for the bike lanes, and then magenta for the cycle tracks, and then the existing bicycle facilities are shown in green. The main thing that I want you to get from this is that the areas with the highest impedance reduction tended to be close to the added bicycle facilities, which makes sense because if you're closer to the bicycle facilities, you're more likely to be able to use them because they'll be closer to the route that you're taking to your destination. So the highest reduction was typically near the proposed bicycle facilities in downtown. And not only is this because of the proximity to the added bicycle facilities, but there are also a lack of existing low-stress bicycle facilities in this area. If you've ever been to downtown Atlanta, there are many one-way streets that will be up to 5 lanes wide and facilitate high-speed vehicle traffic, and they're not pleasant to bike on. We also see reductions in impedance up towards Buckhead, which I pointed out in a previous slide that's to the north, and then near Buckhead or Emory University, which is toward the northeast. All right, another thing to notice is that there's a non-symmetric drop-off in the impedance reduction that is likely due to the existing network connectivity, the link attributes of the surrounding links, or the trip data. So if there's a barrier that prevents people from actually accessing a cycling facility, that would impact this. If there are many high-stress links or high impedance links near the proposed bicycle facilities, then it's going to limit the bicycle facility's ability to mitigate that. And then also if there are fewer trips from certain TAZs that go to the destinations that utilize the bicycle facilities, then that would also reduce that average impedance reduction. All right. Then the next one I'm going to look at is the impedance contribution from each facility, or impedance reduction contribution from each facility. So this metric measures each bicycle facility's effectiveness at reducing trip impedance. So in the previous slide, we were looking at it from that origin or TAZ perspective, and this time we're looking at just the facilities. So this measure considers a link's impedance reduction from the added bicycle facility, the total length of the bicycle facility, which can often span across multiple blocks, so it often isn't contained to just one link. And then it also considers the link between the centrality, which measures how many users used a link as part of the least impedance path. All right. a couple things to take about this graph is that the green represents the added bicycle facilities, and they are symbolized according to size. So the greater the size of the bicycle facility, the higher the impedance reduction contribution. And you may notice that they're labeled with numbers, and what these numbers represent are a ranking based on the facility's impedance reduction contribution. And then I also just want to point out that this orange box up here is to the north of the zoomed in area that we see in the map below. So this was near Buckhead, and I just added it here because some of the higher impedance reduction facilities showed up in this area. All right, so conceptually, as someone who is familiar with the study area, these results do make sense. So this Edgewood Avenue, the one that's highlighted right now, is a major connector for people that live in the more residential part of Atlanta to get to downtown Atlanta, which has a lot of jobs. So adding a bicycle facility in this area, especially when the highway acts as a border that often decreases the number of alternative routes, this would be a high impact facility. And then the other one also makes intuitive sense. So this is Lucky Street Northwest. So this is a major connector between Georgia Tech, which is slightly north of it, to downtown, which is slightly south of it. All right. So the main gist of doing this metric is that we can start to rank different facilities and prioritize them accordingly, so that we know which facilities stand the greatest chance of reducing cycling impedance. All right. So the next metric I'm going to go over is bike sheds. So these are localized to a specific origin, whereas the previous ones we had been looking at the entire study area. These are starting from one point, and they're going to represent the extent of the network or destinations one can access by bike within specified constraints. So there are two figures here. The one on the left represents the travel time impedance factor bike shed. And then the one on the right represents the calibrated impedance factor bike shed. And these are both using 10 minutes. So on the left, that's 10-minute travel time. And then on the right, that's 10-minute impedance. What you'll notice is that the black lines, the areas that you can reach, the shape of that is different between the two. And that is because when you do that and you add in the cycling impedance factors, you're modifying the areas that you can reach, because certain areas are such high impedance that you can no longer reach them. And then some areas have a reduced impedance and you can now reach them. So the area here that was added was along the Atlanta Beltline, which is a multi-use path. And then we go way back to the bootstrap model table. Then we know that the impedance factor for multi-use path is negative. So that's why we see that addition. We can also see how improvements expand the bike shed. So in this case, the added bicycle facilities are shown in crosshatched pattern. And then the links that were added to the bike shed as a result of those improvements are shown in orange. All right, so to summarize, I presented 3 different metrics for assessing bicycle facilities: trip impedance reduction contribution, and bike sheds. So with well-designed and thought-out cycling improvements and network plans, BikeWaySim can serve as a tool for planners and engineers to assess impacts and communicate impacts to the public and decision makers. All right, moving on to my last section, policy implications and future research. So starting with policy implications, the reduction of cycling impedance can be used as a leading indicator for future increases in cycling activity in areas with few existing cycling activities or facilities and cyclists. And planners and engineers can present these results to decision makers and the public as supporting evidence for building bicycle facilities. And BikeWaySim can be actively implemented in evaluating different project alternatives, developing cycling master plans, and the evaluation process for active transportation grant programs. Some requirements for running BikeWaySim today are that right now it's a collection of Python scripts, so knowledge of Python is currently required. A study area needs to be provided, And then ideally, if they're available, cycling GPS traces for that study area. And if those are not available, then the impedance factors that were calibrated using the cycling Atlanta data can act as a placeholder. For now, road attribute data on the number of lanes and the speed limit does need to be provided. But other data, such as network data and traffic signals and the presence of bicycle facilities, these can actually be pulled from OpenStreetMap, which BikeWaySim provides scripts for getting, and then the elevation data can be retrieved from USGS. And then the last thing that needs to be provided are the actual proposed cycling facilities. All right, so onto the future development of BikeWaySim. It's open source, so it can be adapted and modified by other researchers, state DOTs, MPOs, or cities. It can be most improved by collecting more detailed road attribute data and bicycling facility data, and then collecting cycling GPS traces. Both of these would allow for the for more nuanced impedance factors to be developed to evaluate the impacts of non-bicycle infrastructure projects such as road diets and traffic calming. All right, so BikeWaySim and other sims are open source, as I stated, and they're supported by funding provided by the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. And that concludes my presentation, and I'll open it up for questions. But first, I want to just point your attention to the URLs. So if you want to access the development version of BikeWaySim, you can use either one of these links, the full link or the tiny URL. With that, I'll open it to questions, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Reid. That's great. Actually, are those links that you are sharing right now something that we can add to the event page so that folks can reference them in the future?
Yeah. Maybe add the full link just in case the tiny URL one breaks, but yes.
Okay, great. So we don't have too much in the chat at the moment. So if any folks who've been listening and are still with us want to add any questions here, please feel free. We do have roughly 15 minutes for questions. So there's one from Kamala. Do you know what Google Maps uses to assess bike trip suggestions?
No, I don't. And that was part of the motivation for this research, is that I think that there are likely advanced methods for doing this type of routing, but because they're so proprietary and because especially cycling GPS trace data contains a lot of personally identifiable information, they're not necessarily always going to be willing to share that info. But I do know that they at least account for elevation and their travel time adjustments. And they do have some level of trying to navigate you towards bicycle facilities.
All right, great, thank you. And then let's see, we have another one. Thank you for studying bicycle trips with destinations. Did you consider time of day? Many off-road and multi-use paths are either open only dawn to dusk or unsuitable for night riding.
That's a great question. I am writing it up in my future research section for my dissertation. It's something I have definitely considered. But given that the trace data that I was utilizing is at this point many years old, it became really hard to incorporate more time of day dependent variables into the process. But I think this is definitely something that needs consideration, especially when it comes to other things. It's not just multi-use paths, but like the number of cars on a road will change throughout the day. The crowding on a bike or on a multi-use trail may be different throughout the day. You may have one portion of the day where there's a lot of people on the trail, and thus it becomes very hard to bike on.
All right, great. And then we have another one from John with a thank you, and he asks, how will BikeWaySim be disseminated to professionals who need to use it?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So currently I'm working on developing documentation as well as video instructional materials that will allow people that are not myself to use it. And that is currently distributed through GitHub. So it's essentially available now. It can be utilized whenever. So I guess the way that we're distributing that is through that platform.
Right, great. I'm going to mark that one as answered. And then another one here. Can this be used for best path for a multimodal trip, mobility as a service?
Yeah, this is something that I worked briefly on, but I had a previous NCST report that looked at using or modeling first last mile trips using public transportation. So I had a bike portion of the trip modeled so that you could figure out the difference in travel time when you're using a bike with transit versus walking with transit. So that is in that realm. So I do think that this can be incorporated in that because if you have cycling impedance, that gives you some knowledge as to how easy or how difficult it is to complete these style of trips. Because if you have to do a bunch of mode shifts as part of mobility as a service, then it's going to consider the underlying, I guess, friendliness of the network for bicycling. So that should help give a better idea of like what trips should to suggest to people that are using mass apps.
Okay, great. And I'll just note that we have some suggestions coming into the regular chat box. And it looks like they're kind of focused on potential partners or similar projects that might help inform the work that you're doing or vice versa.
Cool.
So just flagging that both for our audience and for you, Reid, for your future work.
Got it. Are
So
those
thank you.
going
This
to
is
be
great.
recorded somewhere? So,
They will be, so we'll download, we can download the transcript of these and send them to you so you can follow up with them if you want to.
all right. Yeah. Thanks for providing those suggestions.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, great. So let's see. Exercise rides, select the better places to ride. Can segments of exercise rides that bypass network gaps be included?
Can you repeat that question? I think you broke up.
Yeah, this is from Lyndall Price. Exercise rides, select the better places to ride. Can segments of exercise rides that bypass network gaps be included?
Yeah. So this one's always difficult because when you start to consider exercise trips, there's definitely these concepts that still come up, but because travel time is not as inherent of a impedance with exercise trips, the methodology or the assumptions that you're making start to break down. So I think there are certain exercise trips that could be useful in highlighting network gaps because people that are exercising or using a bicycle for exercise are still avoiding high stress facilities. It's just that the travel time, using that as a reference isn't as valid. So I think there's definitely room for them, but they may need to be modeled separately.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then we have this is more of a comment than a question. I think it would be beneficial to get a more diverse group of cyclists to inform this modeling, but very cool research. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm gonna mark that as done. And then we have one from Kunte, who is based here at ITS Davis. Thank you very much for the presentation. So I'll start with there's two questions and I'll start with the first one rather than hit you with both at the same time. So any considerations about land use or the built environment characteristics within 100 feet buffer route?
Not currently, but that is something I'm definitely looking into adding. So my process right now is I'm focusing on shifting a lot of the model calibration to high performance computing so that these calibrations can occur more quickly and efficiently so that I can start to test more combinations of variables such as land use. So it's definitely in the pipeline because I think it definitely matters, but not currently.
All right, and then second question, it's interesting to see the impedance reduction led by cycle tracks and bike lanes, but it seems to be very small. Any reasons for that? Maybe some isolation of these improvements from one another, so lack of linking them together?
Oh, as in the actual impedance reduction for both, or sorry, could you repeat that question one more time?
Yeah, let's see. Interesting to see the impedance reduction led by cycle tracks and bike lanes, but seems to be very small. Is there any reason for that?
Got it. So I think there might be a couple parts of that. One thing that I didn't indicate in this, just because of time constraints, are that the impedance factors that are applied can only be so negative. So if the impedance factors get so negative to the point that the link impedance also becomes negative, then we can no longer do shortest path routing with it. So this value had to be greater than 0. So for most cases, the value has to be bounded between 0 and 1. So that is one reason why you might see that, unlike the other variables, which went above 1 on the positive side, the impedance reduction variables were kind of bounded and couldn't go past 1. So that is one reason for that. And then on the cycle track versus bicycle lane thing, I think this is really still due to the cycle tracks there only being about a mile of cycle track in the study area, and that 1 mile wasn't a real cycle track, it was a flex post protected cycle track. So it didn't actually provide a real or like a physical buffer. It more provided the flex post buffers, which definitely adds something. But because of that, plus the fact that there was only one of them, it's hard to really interpret that one cycle track facility. So I imagine if we repeated the study today, where there are more cycle tracks, that difference would be greater.
All right, great. And then we have one last one, at least for now. Can you say more about how link prioritization accounts for potential for use? Was betweenness centrality used and or the OD pair trips from the traffic model?
Not in the impedance calibration process, but in the framework itself, we did have a betweenness centrality measure that looked at how betweenness centralities shifted based on the impedance factor that you were using. So if you were using the travel time impedance factor, or if you're using the calibrated impedance factors. And then that measure that I showed on the impedance reduction contribution also incorporated link betweenness centrality. But currently, the calibration process doesn't incorporate how many cyclists were using a link into that process.
Okay, we had one more just pop in here. Living in a hilly neighborhood for some trips, we take different routes going and coming so that we have a downhill crossing of the busier street in both directions by using a different cross street. How might this be included in impedance?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something I've thought a lot about is how you have different routes to destinations based on which way you're heading. Hills are a great example of that, but it can also happen with left or right turns. Maybe going one way, it's easier to go through one intersection, and then going back the other way is. So on that account, that should be accounted for because the links are directional. So if you're going one way, it'll count as a left or a right turn. And if you're going the other way, it'll reverse that based on the direction. Right now, downhill grade is not considered a variable, but it very easily could be. So that is something I'm definitely thinking about adding into the next run of impedance calibration, is a downhill attribute that indicates downhill grade.
Great. And so that wraps up the questions that we had in the Q&A. We did have a few that were submitted during the registration process, and we might have time for just a couple of those. Got about 6 minutes left, if that works for you, Reid. So let me see here. One of them was, what are the minimum data requirements for local, regional, and state governments to use Bikeway Sim? And I think you already covered this a bit, but if you want to just repeat.
I added, but I can repeat it because does bear repeating. So that would be the slide. So just again, it is a collection of Python scripts, so it definitely takes some knowledge to actually use this currently. But the absolute minimum data requirements are providing a bounding box, so a study area, And then if it is available, road attributes on the number of lanes or speed limit. But if this is not available, it doesn't necessarily need to be provided. Bikeway Sim has scripts for actually gathering most of the data it needs. So it gathers OpenStreetMap data from a site called GeoFabric, and then it gets elevation data from the USGS. And then the other data requirement is providing bicycle facilities so that you can actually assess the impacts of them.
Great. And I don't recall if you answered this one already. How should planners rank impedance, cycling network connectivity, and safety when deciding what bike infrastructure to build?
Yeah, I didn't get to that one. And this is definitely something that kind of hints on the something I was saying in an earlier slide where this still requires planners and engineers to provide well thought out cycling infrastructure suggestions. So I think impedance and comfort are kind of hand in hand in that impedance is some representation of comfort, but safety is a separate, somewhat aligned, or there's some crossover, but it is somewhat of a different method. So if you are actually having safety issues and you're trying to reduce crashes, this approach isn't necessarily going to cover that. So it's important to have your traditional safety studies still in addition to this impedance reduction approach. So one should be, the goal of the impedance reduction is to make cycling easier for people to do, and then for safety, it's to make cycling safer to do. So there is a little bit of difference between those two.
All right, great. And then I had noticed also when folks were registering, some of the questions that came in were kind of focused around how cities can best apply this research, like particularly to their development proposals. And it got me thinking about some like upcoming opportunities that I was wondering if you had thought about at all. Like I'm thinking of Los Angeles and some of the mega events that they have coming up, like the FIFA World Cup in 2026 and the Olympics. And just, you know, as the city tries to kind of figure out how to make its deal with the influx of people coming, if there's an opportunity to use a tool like this to make it less ad hoc and more strategic and intentional to help, you know, move people around the city more safely and effectively. Now, it seems like it could be an opportunity, but I wasn't sure if you'd thought about that.
Yeah, so actually Atlanta has a similar thing because it's also hosting one of the FIFA World Cup games. So one of the objectives here was to get this to the state where we could use it for a cycling infrastructure campaign, so that the city of Atlanta knows what cycling facilities it should really try to prioritize building before the games. So yeah, that's a great like opportunity, and is like, I think a good case of like what a tool like this is really used for. So if there's already some intention of building bicycle facilities, but there's some time constraint and we want to know what to prioritize first. And that is what this tool helps us do.
That's great. Thank you. Well, let me know if Atlanta ends up, you know, utilizing this in some way. Maybe we make it, take some lessons learned to California.
Yeah, will do.
So we're about to wrap up. We've got 1 minute left. I guess my last question for you, Reid, is what comes next for you? You just defended your dissertation. Are you going to be continuing this research, or are you kind of taking a different direction?
It's a little bit unclear yet. I'm still looking for jobs, but I do want to still add to this project. So I'll be developing documentation and whatnot for the next month. And then we'll just see if in the future, I hope to be doing work that is aligned with this type of research, but may not be specifically on Bikeway Sim.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing this research. It's, I think, really, really interesting. And we'll make sure to populate the event page for folks who participated in this webinar with all of the resources that we've been sharing. And so lastly, I just wanted to remind folks to please take a minute to fill out our evaluation form. We'll share it in the chat. I think we already did. And then we'll also send out a follow-up email on Monday. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you again, Reid. Great work.
Thank you. Thanks,
All right,
everyone.
thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.